One of the most important things that we do on the web is to interact with web applications through forms. So forms are fundamental in web applications. And so let's now start learning how to work with forms in React. And first off, when we build forms in React, we use the normal HTML form element. So we have a form, and then here let's add the select, the input, and the button. So just looking at the demo here, in HTML, this is a select element, this is an input element, and this is just a regular button. Here we need to change that as well. And there is a setting in VS Code that will make it so that as I update this one, the closing tag also gets updated, but I will find that out after this video and then I will let you know. But anyway, let's now create that select element. And now here we want to create a bunch of numbers. So inside the select, we create one option with the value. And here let's use again JavaScript mode. So in order to pass in an actual number 1 and not a string of 1, let's just duplicate this a few times because we will actually not use this. So you don't need to write this code if you don't want to. So this is just to show you what we will do instead in a minute here. Let's just create that input first of the type text. And let's also include a placeholder here. And again, this is just normal HTML, what we're doing here right now. Finally, a button with add. Now, okay, beautiful. So that looks just like here, or very similar. So here we have the 1, 2, 3, so these 3 values. But here in the real app, we have 20. So of course, we don't want to write these 20 options over there by hand, right? So instead, what we do is to, inside of JavaScript, we will create an array with the numbers from 1 to 20, and then we will loop over that array and basically create a list of option elements. So let's do that. And we will use a nice trick, which is called array.from. And it's not really important how this function works. So let's just follow this here. And actually, we will do this all the time in React. So this trick is actually quite important. So as a first parameter here, we can pass in an object with the length property and set that to 20. So that will then create an empty array with 20 elements. And then as a second part, we can pass in basically something like a map function. So that will receive as a first argument the current value and as a second argument the index. And so here we are only interested in that index because we will now return that index, which starts at 0 plus 1. And so then we get an array which goes from 1 to 20. And if we wanted, we could just grab this piece of code right here and run it inside of our console, make it a bit bigger. And yeah, indeed, we are missing the key somewhere there, but never mind, we will fix that in a minute. And so indeed, here we get that array from 1 to 20. All right. And now all we need to do is to again use the map method and loop over this to create now a list of these option elements. So again, specifying the value, and now that value is simply num, and we need the key. And that key is also num. So remember how that when we render a list, we need to give each of the elements a unique key. So the number here is of course unique. And then here also num. So give that a save, which makes this a little bit more legible. And so this option is basically just exactly what we had before here manually. But now we create that dynamically here automatically from 0 to 20. So there it is. So since we were speaking of this key here, let's also go to this list and fix the key there. So right here where we have that map, we need to also pass in the key. So that key again needs to be something unique. And what is unique here is this ID property. Well, not yet, but here let's use a 3. And so now these IDs are unique. And so those are the ones we are going to use. So usually when we get an array of objects, each of these objects should have an ID. So that's then the perfect candidate for using here as a key. And again, we will learn later exactly what this key is and why it's so important. But without it, React will always complain. All right, after reloading it, it is gone. And so let's go back to our form. And the form is actually already complete at this point. And so let's now talk about events. So basically what we want to happen is when we click on this button here, we want this form to be submitted. And so we can then react to this form submission with an event handler. So let's do what I just said. First, let's actually create the event handler. And we will do that just like before, right in the component function. So here we create another function, and this one is typically called handle submit. All right, and now all we need to do is to listen for that submit event. So how do you think we do that? Well, we go right here to this form, and then we add on submit. And then all we need to do is to pass in the handle submit function that we just created. And again, really important to understand is that we don't call the function here. So we don't do this. Instead, React will call the function for us as soon as the onSubmit event happens. Now, when exactly is that submit event going to happen? Well, simply as soon as we click here on this button. But for now, of course, nothing is happening because we don't have any logic in our handler function yet. Now, another way in which a form can be submitted is by hitting the enter key while we are here in the submit. So when I'm here and I hit enter, then you see that the form got submitted, actually. So maybe you saw that there was a brief flash of reloading, and that's just the normal behavior of forms in HTML. So that has nothing to do with React. Now let's just do this one more time so I can show you. So writing test and then submitting, watch what happens. So as I told you before, there was like a brief flash and then the page actually reloaded, and so the text that we got here is gone. Now remember that whole conversation about the single page application, where I mentioned that in a single page application like we want to build with React, we usually can submit a form without the page reloading. So in other words, what we want is for this page not to reload. And so we need to disable this default behavior of HTML. So the way we do that is to accept the event here. And then here we can use event.prevent default. And again, this is normal JavaScript right here. So if you're used to working with forms in vanilla JavaScript, then you probably have seen this before. So let's see what happens now when we submit. Yeah, then nothing happens. So that's actually exactly what we want now. We want no reload. So we want to stay here on the same page. So building a single page application. Now what's with this E here actually? How does it get here? Well, as soon as the submit event happens, React will call this handle submit function. And when it does so, it will pass into the function the event object. So an object with all the information about the current event. So again, that's very similar to what happens already in vanilla JavaScript. So here we could also basically write this. So this would be exactly the same, but it's then a bit more obvious what happens. So here, this function gets the event, and then we call handle submit with that event. But that's kind of redundant, so let's remove that. So let's just quickly recap what we did here, which was actually not a lot, but it's still important to understand what happened here. So first of all, we just created our form elements, and then the important part is that we are listening now for the submit event that happens on the form. And that event happens on the form as soon as we click this button or as soon as we hit enter while we are in this input element. And again, that is just some normal behavior of HTML. Now, we could also not listen to the submit event and instead listen for onClick right here. So we could do like this, and then, for example, create a function handle click. So instead of handle submit. So that would also work, but it would only work on the click of the button. So that would then not work when we hit enter while here. But we do actually want that, and so let's instead listen for the submit event. And by doing so, we are leveraging the power of HTML forms. Now, the next question is, how do we actually get this data from the form into this event handler, right? Because, of course, the goal is to do something with this data. So with this quantity and with this item description. Well, there are multiple ways of doing so. So we could get that data right from the event object. So let's just see. We could log this event to the console. So let's see what happens. So here we get this synthetic base event, and we will talk about what the synthetic event is a bit later. But you see that here we get the target, so basically the element on which the event was fired. And then there we have, for example, the input on which we can see the value. So test is exactly what we have here, right? However, in React, we usually don't do this. Instead, we use something called controlled elements. But that's a topic for a whole new video, and so let's now take a break and come back in a second.